Behnam Ben Taleblu joining us to break this down. He's a senior analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. So, Behnam, tell us about why this bill is so problematic for Israel, the U.S., and the world.
Well, great to be back with you. It's actually not the first time the Iranian parliament, also known as the Majlis, has debated this proposition. They tend to do this during nuclear negotiations or when there's a current nuclear-related crisis, usually as a form of leverage. And let's be clear, the decision to actually cease adherence to the additional protocol, kick out the IEA and do things of this nature are beyond the foreign policy reach of the Iranian parliament. So consider it more a move of sentiment, how this largely hardline body is thinking and how it's looking to signal resolve after, as you mentioned, the killing of Iran's most important military nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh Mohammadi.
So you're essentially suggesting that there's no way this will pass. But if it were to pass, how do you think the international community will react?
Well, it could pass, but it may not actually be acted upon. Ultimately, every bill from the parliament has to go through this other body called the Guardian Council, which is also filled with regime loyalists. Now, of course, the parliament is as well. But the regime would have to do something with the bill, meaning act on it. As we know, there are tons of laws on the books in Iran that Iran does not necessarily enforce, and there's some that they zealously over-enforce, like it relates to headscarf policing, for instance. But in this, I would expect it to be a tool in the hands of the late Rouhani government in its last few months, as well as whoever comes into power after the elections this June, that could be used as a bludgeon to threaten Europe or threaten America or even threaten countries in the region, such as Israel, with removing the impediments on Iran's nuclear program.
Now, this comes, like we mentioned, after the killing of the top Iranian nuclear scientist, Fakhrizadeh, which Iran is continuing to blame on Israel and to threaten the Israeli people over. I mean, how concerned do you think Israel should be about these threats?
Well, I think there will likely be some kind of retaliation, so it's wise not to dismiss them. But I think that the major scenario put forth in a hardline Iranian newspaper over the weekend, that Haifa would have to be struck in a fashion greater than the missile barrage against the U.S. bases in January in response to the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the Quds Force commander, that is something I would put at low probability, high impact. But just as we've seen in the past, like in 2012, where there was a series of terror attacks and attempted assassinations of Israeli civilians, diplomats, interests, and assets across multiple countries, including Bulgaria, Thailand, India, and Georgia, some successful, some unsuccessful. This could be a tried and tested method for Iran's terror apparatus to try to strike back at Israel.
Well, at this point, I mean, what should the international community be doing in response to this vote?
I think ultimately it's going to have to be about wanting to put the right kind of pressure on Iran to make sure that scientists like Fakhrizadeh Mohammadi aren't showing up to work every day. This doesn't mean assassinations, of course. It simply means putting these individuals out of work, getting Iranian nuclear scientists who work on the weapons dimensions of their program to actually find a different line of work, continuing tough sanctions, and ultimately keeping the door open for diplomacy for a genuinely comprehensive deal, not the resurrection of the fatally flawed 2015 nuclear deal known as the JCPOA. If there is a reversion to that fatally flawed deal, it'll be the interest of the friends and acquaintances of the likes of Mohammadi, who kept the military option for that nuclear program alive.
All right, Behnam, thank you so much for joining us and breaking that down.